Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are in the third class of our series, War and Peace in Jewish Tradition. And today, we're going to delve into one particular issue. And the reason I've chosen that is because it is what's on everyone's mind. And it has been for the last few months. And so I wanted to look at all the different opinions surrounding the idea of, in Hebrew, it's pidyon shivuim, freeing captives. And we're going to see that there are many, many different opinions. It's really quite complicated, many different circumstances. But this is very topical because everyone knows that at the beginning of the war, there were approximately 250 captives, Israelis and people from other countries. And it's been a huge issue. Again, as everyone knows, last week, there was a temporary ceasefire. And we got back approximately 100 of the hostages. There's still approximately 150, though it's completely unknown how many are actually still alive or not. Still, we assume most of them are alive. And so we're going to delve in tonight in the different laws, opinions voiced throughout the ages about this very important issue. So I'm going to be giving a lot of sources and a lot of opinions. And this is just it's a beautiful example of how we deal with Jewish law developing over literally thousands of years. And as circumstances change and different factors involved, how does Jewish law deal with this? Okay, so we're going to start that in Bava Batra, in the Gemara, on 8b. This mitzvah of freeing captives is called a mitzvah gedola, a great mitzvah. And it has been treated like that throughout the ages. That even if we go back to the first instance where we have this idea of freeing captives, goes back to Avram. And that is when there was the war between 4 kings and 5 kings. And Avram's nephew was taken captive. Avram basically was not involved in the war. But once he heard that his nephew was taken captive along with many of the people in Sodom, so Avram travels all the way up north. There are different opinions how many people went with him, but in all cases, it was a relatively small number. And he went all the way up to Damascus. And he was able to free not only his nephew, but all the captives from Sodom, and he returned them to their homes. So this is approximately 3,700 years ago already. The Torah is showing here Avram is Ish Chesed. He's known as the one of loving kindness. And yet here we see him very gevuradik, being very strong and actually fighting a war against the 4 kings to get the captives back. Later in history, and it's coming up in very soon in Hanukkah, there is a story that after the Maccabees restored and rededicated the temple, what many people don't know is the war against the Greeks lasted for 25 years. When we rededicated the temple, that was only in the 3rd year, meaning we had reconquered Jerusalem, but not the rest of the country. And so the war went on for another 22 years after that. Some point in that war, there was a village up north where many of the Jews were taken captive into what's modern day Syria. In fact, not that far from where Avram went. And so I don't know all the details of the story, but the Maccabees traveled day and night, and they went up north and they were able to free the captives. So here we see in our history how important this mitzvah is. And then in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar in Parshat Chukat, there's a story of the king of Arad, who he's called a Canaanite, but Rashi says it was really Amalek that attacked us, and they just dressed up as they were Canaanites to confuse Israel. And it says that a captive was taken, one captive. And Israel made a vow to God that if God would assist them in defeating the enemy, and they made this neder because of, not just because of the war, because of this hostage who was taken, this captive, that they would dedicate all the spoils to God. And in the end, they did win the war. So here we see in the Torah itself, going back to the story of Hanukkah, this issue comes up. Later in history, it came up a lot. It came up a lot that in different places, Jews were taken captive, usually jailed for no good reason, with the hope of getting ransom money. It was considered an easy way to get money by capturing Jews and holding them for ransom. So in that context, the Rambam, Maimonides, around 1,000 years ago, says that this mitzvah is so important that if someone who has the opportunity, we don't always have the opportunity. Right now, we have a government. And so individuals don't get involved that much because we have a government that is supposed to deal with this kind of thing. But in the old days, different communities would raise money and negotiate to get back captives. And it was considered a tremendous mitzvah. And the Rambam says anyone who has the ability to help free captives and doesn't has transgressed 3 mitzvah. One is, it says in the Torah that you shouldn't harden your heart against your brother. If you're in that verse, it's about a poor Jew who needs financial assistance, and you just turn your head. You pretend you don't know or not going to get involved. So Rambam says that that person has transgressed this mitzvah of not hardening your heart and assisting another Jew. The second one, he said, is there is a mitzvah not to stand by the blood of your brother. And meaning, again, that if a Jew is in trouble and you have the opportunity to help and you don't, then you have transgressed this mitzvah. And the third one is simply v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, to love your neighbor as yourself. Because if you were taken captive, you would want everyone to work for your freedom. So that's from the Rambam. That's from Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah, where he says that it's such an important mitzvah that we would be transgressing 3 mitzvot if we don't attempt to help. In the Shulchan Aruch from 500 years ago, Maimonides is approximately 1,000 years ago. The Shulchan Aruch is around 500 years ago. And there it's written that if someone has the ability to help free a captive, and again, this pretends that he doesn't know anything, he can't get involved, whatever. The Shulchan Aruch says he's complicit in murder, because many times captives would die in captivity. And so the Shulchan Aruch is a very strong statement that it's as if you're part of murdering someone. Okay, so now we go back to what's probably called the foundational discussion about freeing captives is in the Masechet of Gittin. It's on page 45a of Gittin. And here, the Mishnah says the following, and based on this Mishnah, there is a lot of discussion of how to apply this Mishnah, because in the Gemara itself, it never definitively explains exactly how we put into practice what it says in the Mishnah. So what it says in the Mishnah is that when there are captives, there are 2 things that they say about this. Is one, that we shouldn't try to pay more than a person is worth. And there is a whole discussion. Well, what do you mean how much of a person is worth? So 2 of the opinions, and there are probably more, is in those days, slavery still existed. And so there was a kind of like within world culture, what different people in different circumstances were worth. So one of the opinions is we calculate on what a person's worth would be. We'll call it in the market. The other opinion is depending on what financial situation they were in. If it was a rich person or if it was a poor person. And so therefore, if it's a rich person, so maybe the community could go ahead and then they would get the money back. But what happens if it's a poor person and there's no way to recoup the money? Now, we have to understand that even though, we'll say today, in most circumstances, this is not a totally across the board statement, but in general, Jews are financially in good shape. But that was not true for most of history. Even though there were wealthy, influential Jews in countries around the world, in Christian countries and Muslim countries, sometimes very wealthy, very influential. But usually the masses of the people were extremely poor. And so the Mishnah says that we don't pay more than what a person is worth for 2 reasons. And what's interesting is that they use the term tikkun olam, the rectification of the world. Now, in today's term, that is used many, many times to talk about the whole concept of fixing the world, healing the world, improving the world, tikkun olam. We say it in the Aleinu prayer 3 times a day. L'taken olam b'malkut shakai. to rectify the world in the kingdom of God. But here in the Mishnah, it says that there are two factors that we have to keep in mind, and we do it for tikkun olam, meaning what's good for the community. So the first general principle is that, again, we don't put a huge burden on the communal coffers to free captives. And the first reason is connected to the second reason. And this is where there's a lot of disagreement and discussion. The second factor is so that the those who are capturing people won't be encouraged to do it more and more. In other words, if someone is a captive and they ask for, I'm just throwing out a number, $1 million, and the community comes up with it, then the idea is, well, let's just grab more people and we'll just get more and more money. And it's what's called a good svara, because if people capture people and then they see that the community is not going to go overboard, they will ransom them, but not for exorbitant amounts of money that will break the public bank, break the community, because then they'll be encouraged to do it more and more. Those are the two factors that are put. And the discussion is, how linked are they? And is it a question that you're not permitted to pay more than, we'll call it even like a minimal amount, a reasonable amount? Or is it that you're not obligated? That if you want to, if a community wants to, they could. And that is not really resolved. And that's why over the generations, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of different opinions as to what exactly it means that you shouldn't pay more than the community can bear, so it won't encourage them to take more captives. Now, one of the most famous cases of this is one of the greatest rabbis in Europe in approximately 800 years ago. His name was Maram Rothenberg, and he was really one of the greatest of all of Jewish legal minds at that time. He was taken captive, and the community was more than willing to pay a lot of money from him. And in fact, one of the opinions in the Gemara, in the discussions of freeing captives, is that if it's a Talmid Chacham, if it is a great, wise person that everyone accepts as being one of the leaders of Jewish tradition, then you could ransom for a lot of money. So the Maram Rothenberg, he told his students, do not ransom me under any circumstances, because if you do, they're just going to continue, and they will capture more and more people. He wanted to set a precedent to the people around that even me, why bother with just little people? That it was known that how much the community honored him, and he refused to be ransomed. And the story is, he was held in captivity for 7 years, and he died in captivity. And he wouldn't bend. He put the community before himself, and he felt that it was the right thing to do. And it was a very, very famous case. what we're told is after he died, then they held the body so it couldn't have a proper Jewish burial. And at that point, the community went ahead and did ransom for a substantial amount of money just to be able to bury him with the proper Jewish tradition and honors. So this was a very, very important case where he held very much like the Mishnah, is that I refuse to let the community, spend so much money, which will only encourage them to do it again and again. Now, there are other opinions in other tractates. One of the opinions is in Ketubot, where it says that even though the other Mishnah says you can only ransom up to the worth of a person, it says that a husband, and we assume a wife, could ransom their spouse for 10 times the normal amount. And they base it on an interesting idea that when the Mishnah originally said that you can't ransom for a lot of money, that is because it's taking from the public coffers. So they said halakhically, an individual is not bound by that. If an individual has a lot of money, he's allowed to send messages and ask his family to ransom him for whatever they're asking for. So in other words, this idea of ransoming doesn't apply to an individual. And so they hold that since a husband and wife are like one body, it's a very spiritual concept. We talk about soulmates. So halakhically, it's as if the man and woman are one body. Therefore, they're like ransoming themselves. And so therefore they could go way over the normal amount. Then a story is told later in Gittin on 58a that Yoshua ben Chanina lived at the time of the Romans ruled over Israel. And for many hundreds of years, while Rome ruled, some of the greatest scholars, including Rabbi Akiva, used to go to Rome fairly often to represent, as it were, the government of Israel. At that time, the sages were the leaders. And so Yeshua ben Hananiah was one of the greatest leaders and extremely wise. Many stories about him that he was incredibly smart. And so once he was in Rome, and I don't remember the circumstances, but he saw that in captivity there was a young boy, and he saw that this boy was just like shining. And he spoke with him, and he saw that this little child is like a genius. And so the Gemara says this is one of the sources that for a wise person, a Talmid Chacham, they could ransom for a lot of money. And so he ransomed this young boy, and this young boy became Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, who was also one of the greatest of the sages. When he grew up, he became one of the greatest of the sages. So that was one of the sources that for a Talmid Chacham, you could ransom for a lot of money. Then you have the Tosfot. The Tosfot come in the 11th century, 12th century. They were all sons-in-laws, at least the first ones, of Rashi. And they said that after the temple was destroyed, now here we're going to see how the halacha develops depending on the factors. So the Tosfot held that after the temple was destroyed and the, one second. There we go. After the temple was destroyed, it had become so common to capture people to get ransom. They said that the laws that were originally set didn't apply anymore, because if the whole thing is you can't pay a lot of money to ransom because it will encourage them to do it again and again. But apparently it was happening so often then that there was like no encouragement involved. It was just happening. It was either you get the captives back or you don't. The Radbaz was around 500 years ago. He lived in Egypt. Later he came to Israel. He was connected to the Arizal, and he was a great arbitrator of Jewish law. And apparently in his different opinions, he found many, many different reasons why you could pay more than just the minimal. Okay, so now we're going to add a few more very, very important ideas. And all this is going to bring us up to the current situation. As we started, everyone knows that we have captives. And last week, the opinion is the only reason that Hamas let anyone go was that they were taking such a beating. They desperately needed a ceasefire. And so they, we'll call it, traded for each captive that they gave back. We released 3 that were in our jails, 3-1. But there are 2 famous cases. There are many, many times in the last 75 years that terrorists have taken captives. And in many, many cases, it ended with the army attempting to free the captives by force. And there is an opinion in the halacha that we should not try to free captives by force, because if we do, then in the future, if captives are taken, they will be treated much worse. Much worse. But again, not everyone holds like this. So many, many times, the most famous case, of course, is in 1976, when terrorists hijacked a plane to Uganda, Entebbe. And I think everyone knows the story that a whole plane full of people were held in the airport, and the terrorists were negotiating that let X amount of our people in your jails go, and we'll let them go. And while the negotiations were going on, so Israel attempted an extremely daring rescue, which succeeded in that Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu's brother, who was one of the leaders of the rescue, he died. And I believe another 1 or 2 people died, but they were able to rescue all of the captives. And that was in 1976. It was on July 4th. It was the 200th anniversary of American independence. And it sent shockwaves through the world that Israel was able to accomplish this. But there were many other times that captives were taken, and Israel attempted to free them. Some of them worked, and some of them ended up very tragically, because that was at a time where the government of Israel, in principle was, we will not negotiate with the terrorists. And so they attempted to free them forcibly. Over the years, that changed. And many times they would ask different rabbis for their opinions. And so two of the cases in the recent years was, I don't know, about 10 years ago, one soldier was taken, Gilad Shalit, and he was held for 5 years in Gaza. And finally, the government released 1,000 terrorists, many of them that had murdered, had blood on their hands, 1,000 for one. A few years before that, the terrorists in Gaza had 3 bodies. They weren't even alive. But for the families, it was just such torment to know that their children were being held by, their bodies were being held by terrorists, that Israel also, over 1,000 terrorists were freed. What happened, though, is in both cases, they saw, because they know exactly who they were releasing, many, if not most of the terrorists went back to terrorism and caused many, many people to die at their hands. And so that rationale kind of ended. That's why here Israel gave 1 for 3, not 1 for 1,000. And this goes back to that when Israel did trade 1,000, so that absolutely gave such incentive to capture more people. And that's obviously what happened on October 7th. They were probably thinking, we'll take 250 captives. They wanted to get all the terrorists out of jail, including all the people who had murdered and killed multiple people. So far it hasn't happened, and I don't believe that it will happen. So I just want to add a few more opinions here. There's another opinion. These are all Jewish law opinions as it developed. One of the ideas is everything we've said up to now doesn't apply in times of war. Because if the whole idea is not ransoming for a lot of money, because it will encourage people to capture more people, that's not in wartime. In wartime, it's almost assumed that there will be what's called prisoners of war. That's just what's assumed. And so these rules don't apply. The question is, in what does apply? And that's where we have a gray area. We have a gray area. And even in the last week or so, there were everyone wanted to free the captives. The question is, how do we do it best? And the government basically is trying to do 2 things at once: free the captives and destroy Hamas at the same time. And that makes it very, very difficult, because in theory, we could just have a ceasefire and say, okay, we're going to leave you alone, leave Hamas in rulership of Gaza, and we'll get the captives back. But the people of Israel just want both of them. The question is, how do we do that in the best way? And so right now, after the ceasefire ended, the idea is, and apparently it's happening as we're speaking, Israel has basically taken over the entire Gaza Strip now. They've now taken over the whole south, not the whole, because they're still shooting a few missiles here and there, certainly not like at the beginning of the war. And Hamas is really on the run now. So we're going to see what happens here. And then there are many, many current opinions that we have a different class of factors now, because almost all the discussions over thousands of years really was captives for ransom for money. But the new factor is ransom by letting go terrorists, who almost always will go back to killing. So that's a whole different factor. Like, let's say you release 1,000 terrorists for one person, but then those 1,000 terrorists go back to terrorism and kill hundreds of people. So that also is not reasonable, not logical to operate in that way. So that is the new factor. We're talking about ransom of letting go terrorists. And here again, there are different opinions of using basic Jewish principles. Now, there is one principle that we haven't even spoken about, which we might have mentioned in the beginning, was called pikuach nefesh, saving a life, danger to life. We know that on Shabbat or holiday, if there's a danger to life, you break any law of Shabbos. The laws of Shabbos don't apply anymore if it's a matter of saving a life, or even a doubt about saving a life. Then it supersedes keeping the laws of Shabbat. But they say that in the time of war, the principle of pikuach nefesh doesn't apply, because the whole thing is pikuach nefesh. Any soldier who goes into battle, there's a doubt whether they'll come back or not. And so all of the different reasonings that we've used up to now in the time of war don't exactly apply. That's why it's such a difficult thing to know, according to Jewish law, what the right thing is to do. And so, as I mentioned, over the last years, when these cases have happened, the government has asked great rabbis. And in almost every case, when different rabbis were asked, they basically said, yes, the government can negotiate, but they didn't put, but you can only let these many terrorists go for these many people. These kind of general principles have not really been set. And so that's why it's such a fluid situation now, what to do with the captives. It's clear that 2 weeks ago, the government of Israel, even though there were voices that were saying, no, we should continue the war and force them to give back all 250, not to start negotiating 10 a day, and give them an opportunity to rearm themselves, reorganize themselves, which will give them a better chance to kill soldiers. So you see what difficult choices have to be made here. Really, life and death choices, and it's really hard to say what is the right or the correct track to follow when, again, we're not talking about money, we're talking about releasing terrorists with blood on their hands, who in almost every case will go back to killing other people. So this is the difficulty here. So here we've gone through like the development of halacha, many different opinions. Many times Jewish law is much more definitive, but because of changing factors and between the individual rights and communal rights, it's a very, very difficult topic to weigh according to Jewish principles. So now I'm going to mention one other captive that is mentioned in the Torah that we didn't mention, and that is Dinah. Dinah goes into the town of Shechem. Yaakov and family have bought some property. This is after Yaakov has met with Esav, and he moves on, and now he is living outside of Shechem. And Dinah goes, and it says, to like check out the young ladies in town, like what they're like. And the son of the ruler takes her and rapes her. And then he falls in love with her. It's a very complicated case. There's a lot of mystical ideas connected with this. But the simple understanding is that he was holding her ransom. And he said to his father, please negotiate with Yaakov. I want to marry her. So we could even use the term date rape, because it wasn't like what happened on October 7th. Is somehow his attraction was much deeper than just a physical attraction. Nonetheless, the words in the Torah is that he forced her, he raped her, and he was holding a ransom. He didn't let her go. And so, as the story goes, Shimon and Levi come up with this plan and say, yeah, we will let our sister marry this prince, but everyone has to be circumcised. And so the king wants to please his son, and he tells the people, this is what they're demanding from us. We have to do circumcision, and then our children will marry their children. But then he says, and everything of theirs will become ours. In other words, his plan was, we're the majority here. We'll take over. Yaakov was extremely wealthy at that point, and that was the plan. They went ahead and circumcised themselves, and then Levi and Shimon came in and killed all the men in town. And then Yaakov was not happy with this, and he gave them rebuke. And then the story ends with Shimon and Levi saying, and should we allow our sister to be treated like this? And the story ends. So obviously there's a lot of discussion. It's an extreme story. And the commentaries ask, on what basis did Shimon and Levi kill everyone in town? Oh, I should have mentioned, after they did that, they found Dinah and took her out of there. She was a captive. And so one of the commentaries is that at the time of the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, which was somewhat accepted in the world, one of the things is of course, rape. And one of the laws of Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach is if one of the laws is you have to have laws of justice. And so since the people didn't do anything about this, so they figured, they understood that the whole town was responsible for this. And on that basis, they killed everyone in town. Again, it's a very controversial. Yaakov, even on his deathbed, was still rebuking them for what they did. But again, the Torah ends with this idea, like the brothers had the last word. And should we have allowed our sister to be raped and held captive and not do anything? And that's how the story ends. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it is a story of a captive. But one of the biggest issues worldwide that's being discussed right now is what are called innocent civilians. It's a very, very controversial subject. There are many, many different opinions. What I will say, and I've said this before, that despite what the world says and is saying, there's no army in the world that attempts to protect innocent civilians as much as Israel. But this is wartime. And the problem is, and not every army does this, Hamas hides behind civilians. Since we went into Gaza, we have found in schools, kindergartens, private homes, hospitals, mosques, they're armed to the teeth. The tunnels are running under them. And Hamas did this on purpose because they know that Israel attempts to protect civilians. And there's been, for years, Israel, before they'll bomb, they drop leaflets. They tell people, you should leave now because we're about to go into your neighborhood. I should just mention that there's been a war going on in Syria for the last, 10 to 15 years. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people have been killed. Something like a quarter of the country had to leave the country with their shirts on their back. It's said that in Iraq and Afghanistan, during those wars in the last 20, 30 years, also about 100,000 civilians were killed. In World War II, in the millions, tens of millions of people were just carpet bombed all over the place. Iran and Iraq fought a war. Over 1 million people died. They were just shooting rockets at each other's cities. It had nothing to do with armies. And that we have the blessing that we have what's called the Iron Dome. Because over the last 20 years, they have shot, who knows, 20, 30,000 missiles, each one at civilian cities, with the intention of killing as many people as they can. We have the great blessing of having the Iron Dome that is shooting down their missiles. So this is a huge topic. The series is War and Peace. And it's such a difficult situation because if we didn't go into Gaza, we could never defeat them. And that means that they would do what they've been saying they would do over and over again. One of the leaders of Hamas went on world television only a few days afterwards and said, we will do it again and again and again. So what is Israel supposed to do? And so, yes, we'll call it innocent civilians. But then there's a question, how innocent are they? If they allow their homes, their kindergartens, their schools, their mosques, their hospitals to be used, and that they are human shields. So we could debate how much choice the people of Hamas have. That's probably the debate. But most likely, most of the people in Gaza support Hamas. They were giving out candies after October 7th. They were celebrating. So these are very difficult questions, very controversial. Many people have what to say, but it's somewhat hypocritical. In fact, tremendously hypocritical for at least Western nations to say, yes, you should destroy Hamas. You'll be doing us a favor. If we don't, believe me, they're coming after them in 10 years or 20 years. We're doing the world the biggest favor in the world. Oh, but you're committing war crimes. Well, it can't work both ways. Tell Hamas to stop using civilians as human shields. What can we do? Anyways, I'm not saying all this to be controversial, but if we're having a series called War and Peace, and we want to talk not just theoretically, but deal with the actual issues of the day. So here we're trying to look at Torah sources, halachic sources, and as I said before, sometimes the Jewish law is much more definitive. But there are many, many areas of Jewish law. It depends which rabbi you ask, because there's legitimate ways in a Torah perspective to see different circumstances. And so right now, I just want to say I did look up a score of sources about what is the Jewish legal view of civilians during wartime, and this was unanimous. It was unanimous that we never purposely kill innocent people who are not involved in the war. But we don't have to put ourselves and our own troops in danger in order not to harm people. In other words, Gaza went to war with us. We didn't start the war. Hamas rules Gaza. And yes, there are probably people who would prefer Hamas not to be in charge. And most likely after this debacle, I would hope that most of the people in Gaza would be like, okay, enough. Let's just fix up the place and live normal lives, which they could have done. We left there 15 years ago. They could have been a very productive, economically thriving little enclave. They chose differently. And the people there allowed it to happen. The majority of people allowed it to happen. So there is a real question, who is innocent there? Since we don't know, we go out of our way not to harm civilians, but we have to win the war. As we said before, and many commentaries have said this, Israel is the only country in the world that is not allowed to win a war. Any other country is allowed. We don't want, like I said, the Security Council probably hasn't met more than 2 times about what's happening in Syria in 15 years. Look what's happening in Ukraine. Russia's just shooting at cities. It's not like at armies. They're just shooting at cities. And so how can anyone be so hypocritical that we're doing something terribly wrong, which they do all the time? Anyways, I want to now finish, because I said that every session that we would have war and peace. So I don't want to leave it like this, because we want peace. The last 2 classes, we talked about how important peace is to Israel, how much we long for it, how much in fact, that's one of the reasons we fell asleep here, is we had this illusion of trying to come to peaceful relations with Hamas. And now everyone realizes it's impossible. It's basically Amalek, and it's impossible. It's either they win or you win. And it's not like that with all of our enemies. This we're talking about Amalek energy. So since we're running a little bit late, so the great prophets of Israel, virtually all of them, you'll see that there are warnings of mass destruction, exile, if Israel doesn't get its trip together. If we don't build a ethical society, a loving society, and if we worship other gods, we don't listen to the Torah, then all the prophets came and said, like, just change your ways or you're asking for destruction. On the other hand, in almost all of the prophets are prophecies of peace to come in the time of the Messianic era. And so sometimes they're so juxtaposed, it's almost startling. There's this harsh, strident language about what we're risking by not acting appropriately. And then the next verse is about this incredible peace that we could have. So I just want to end this class with just reading a couple of the prophecies. One of them is one of the most famous because it actually appears at the United Nations, towards the entrance of the United Nations. This quote from Isaiah, 2nd chapter, 4th verse. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. One of the most famous quotes from Isaiah, and this is, of course, is talking about at the time of the Mashiach, time of the Messianic era. But what's important, and like I said, almost every one of the prophets has prophecies of a worldwide peace to come. Peace and harmony and cooperation that will come. And that's why it's been such an important part of the Jewish vision for the world, that this is where we're going. It's not like an evolutionary view that there's no direction to the world, it just happened the way it happened. We have prophecies from God that there's a purpose, there's a direction, there's an end game, and there is what to look forward to. And so that's why peace is always in our minds. As we said previously, we end every prayer with the word peace. The priestly blessing ends with peace. The end of the Gemara, the end of the mission, the end of the oral Torah, is that there's no vessel for blessing like peace. We greet each other on Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. Or in general, just Shalom. Like it's on our lips all of the time, because this is our deepest hope. So all of the reality that we're living through here is what's called Ein Breira. We have no choice in this situation. It's really kill or be killed. And we discussed that. According to Jewish law, if you're being threatened to be killed, you are not only allowed, you're supposed to get up and defend yourself. Okay, we're going to continue here. Another one from Isaiah. I, God, have called you in righteousness and will hold your hand and keep you and give you for a covenant to the people, to be a light to the nations, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from the prisons and those that sit in darkness out of their confinement. So this is as close as we could get to a mission statement of Judaism, is to be a light unto the nations. Now this is from Micha, and this is probably one of the most comprehensive ones. Micha lived at the same time as Isaiah. They live, and you'll see that one part of this is the exact same quote from Isaiah. They were granted the same prophecy. But this is really one of the most beautiful of all of them. This is from the 4th chapter of Micha. And it shall be at the end of the days that the mountain of God's house shall be firmly established at the top of the mountains, and it shall be raised above the hills, and people shall stream upon it. And many nations shall come, and they shall say, come, let us go up to God's mountain, into the house of the God of Jacob, and let him teach us of his ways, and we will go in his paths. For out of Zion will come Torah, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, and the word of God from Jerusalem, u'devar Hashem Yerushalayim. And he shall judge between many peoples, and reprove mighty nations from afar. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And they shall dwell, each man under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the God of hosts has spoken. That is our dream, that is our vision, that is our hope. And we have to see through the present circumstances and know this is where we're going. And this actually, paradoxically, we dealt with this last week. This is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for peace, even though that sounds oxymoronic, but we talked about it last week, so I'm not going to go back into it. But the verse says, Hashem oz li'amo yitain, Hashem yivarech amo b'shalom. God will give you strength, and God will bless you with peace. And so here as paradoxical as it sounds, for us to get to peace. And I believe with a whole heart that we will have peace one day with our Arab neighbors and with Ishmael and with Esav, and there will be a spiritual global village at the time of Mashiach. So that's a good place to end tonight. And God willing, Hashem should help us free all of the captives, should end this war as soon as possible. And I truly mean this, that the people of Gaza could be freed from being forced into war after war after war with us, and we could live in friendly relations with all of our neighbors. Be'ezrat Hashem.